Top 10 albums of 2017. Let's hit it, because I'm so late to the party on this freaking type of video. Jesus Christ. By the way, I'm going to be reading most of this off the Google Docs that I made over the year as I kept notes on the album. Let's not waste any more time. Let's jump right into the list. So, I was recording the video last night, trying to get it done before going to bed, and my battery for my Nikon died, and, well, I only have one battery, so I had to take a mulligan, and we're going to start from the top. Let's consider that a false start. At number 10, we got Saturation 3 by Brockhampton. If you're not aware of who Brockhampton is, I applaud your ability to live under a rock so well, because it was almost impossible not to hear about Brockhampton. Even before I listened to the albums, I follow a lot of React channels like Sean C, Tabby, Big Quint, things like that. The album was all over the place, so I was like, I know of a Brockhampton, I know of a Saturation. What's the deal with all these records coming out in 1 year? Who are these guys? And then you dive in and you listen to the records and you're like, oh my god, this is what pop music should have been from the beginning. Because the experimentation is subtle. It's very, very subtle. It's what gives Brockhampton's music a bit of a nudge and an edge against regular mainstream pop that's coming out these days. Why is it so low on my list then? Why is it only at number 10 then, you know, like number 7 or what have you? I wanted to throw one of the Saturation albums on my list somewhere. And for me, Saturation 3 has the best flow of tracks. It feels very cinematic in its ability of going from one track to the next track to the next track. There's no stalling in this album, so to speak. Even though that's there, flow of rapping in general, the flows that they present with their lyrics, that's not to say the lyrics aren't bad. That's not to say that I don't like that flow, because I love how unapologetic N.E.R.D is when he comes onto his verse. When he enters the verse, he's just like, I don't give a f***, here's how I'm gonna say it. At the same time, it gets entirely repetitive, and it happens on almost every single track on this album, and you're just like, N.E.R.D, do you have other flows? I will say, one of the major things that made this album only at number 10 on my top 10 of 2017 was because of that Brockhampton flow. Overall, I do find myself putting this album on heavy rotations these days. I've actually listened to it more in 2018 than I did in 2017. Another reason why it's so low on my list. I think this is an album everyone should listen to, because you're at least going to find one track on here. Their primary goal overall, though, is just to make an album that you want to dance to, and they succeeded. Saturation 3 is that album. Favorite tracks: Boogie, Sister Slash Nation, Stains, Stupid, Zipper, that piano sampling is fire, Hottie, and the closing track, Team, which Bareface's singing and guitar work in the first half of that track make me freaking cry. It's incredible. At number 9, we got Pharma by N.E.R.D. I am a giant music geek, bordering on hipster, so I gotta throw a Vaporwave album somewhere on my top 10 of 2017 list. And out of all the Vaporwave that came out in 2017, there isn't one project that stands out as much as N.E.R.D's Pharma. From the opening lines of Understand, the intro, which is literally just, there's so much you don't understand, why don't you smoke this? Maybe you'll start, which then transitions beautifully and hauntingly into No One, going through all the tracks and ending in the fade out of Left Alone in a Blue Room. The experience of listening to this album is the most frenetic drug trip of your life. You climb up, you crash, you fringe upon overdosing, you just hit that ledge, you're like, oh my god, I'm there. But overall, the drug itself is consumption. Consumptions of goods, from the material to the chemical, with capitalism as its satanic supplier. This album is the auditory experience of a fried brain on its last 2 good brain cells, trying to understand existentialism before going comatose. And it's kind of cool how this album does go back to Vaporwave's Plunderphonics roots. You're really amazed at times that a majority of these tracks, if not all these tracks, are just purely samples, chopped and screwed and remixed to the artist's specification. I will say, N.E.R.D as an artist, by taking all these different samples and going back to Vaporwave's Plunderphonics roots, the artist ends up making a statement about this kind of like consumption overdose that you kind of see in a lot of American and Western media now. It just feels like too much stimulation. It's overstimulation. And this album perfectly encapsulates that overstimulation with brief moments of serenity that are still sad because they're synthetic, they're not real, and it's beautiful how this album does that. My one gripe I will say with this album is that it overstays its welcome. That's the reason why it's at number 9. I liked it a little bit more than Saturation 3 just simply because I'm a huge Vaporwave nerd and I got into Saturation 3 so late. I would recommend Saturation 3 to someone new to music that I like. I think like Pharma would be a little bit too much for a first time listening experience. I've listened to this 3 times all the way through. After that, I can only get so far. I think it's somewhere around Acid Baby that my attention just dies off and I'm just like, While I get the point of Vaporwave is to be background music in a sort of sense, it's supposed to be ethereal, and the fact that it's there and then it's gone. This album captures my imagination, but it doesn't hold my imagination for the entire duration. It did for 3 listens, and then after that I was like, I can't, this is too experimental, this is too much. Can you even consider this music? Great album. A few of the tracks could have been, left on the cutting room floor, but fantastic experience from front to back. Favorite tracks? No One, Mall Full of Drugs, love that title. Bass Cop, Cocktails in Space, and God, I love Vaporwave titles. Weed Jesus. At number 8, we got Flying Microtonal Banana by King Gizard and the Lizard Wizard. And if you haven't heard of them, you're probably thinking, that's the greatest band name ever, Ethan. Holy sh! Well, while Brockhampton is the hardest working group in hip-hop, King Gizard was the hardest working group in rock last year, period. Because they had a plan to release not 3 albums in 1 year, but 5. And they did it. Okay, well, maybe Gumbo Soup did come out in January of 2018, but I'll give him that mulligan. 5 freaking albums in 1 year, and what was so interesting about this concept was that each album would pose a drastically different change in pace, style, instrumentation, and artistic direction. They did freaking elevator music for 1 album. It all started with this puppy, and out of all the albums that they got in this 5 album in 1 year deal, I think this one stuck the landing the hardest conceptually. It deals with microtonal tuning and compositions using that microtonal tuning. For those of you who are not musicians or big old music nerds, you might be like, what the heck is microtonal? You got whole tones, which are the white keys on the piano. You got semitones, which are the black keys on the piano. Microtones are the keys in between the keys, the notes that you can't play on a piano because they're not in our traditional Western scale. They're usually found in Eastern scales and in Eastern Indian music and things like that. Overall, that is a very brief explanation of it, and I did a lot of paraphrasing. You can go more in depth with that. Check out Adam Neely's video. Check out This Exists video on microtonal tuning. It's phenomenal. But when you watch that video and you realize how much modification goes into your actual instrument in order to play these microtones, you realize what an undertaking King Gizard did when they said, okay, this entire album, we're going to write our music based on microtonal tuning. We're going to write music based on notes that we can't play. So we're going to have to revamp and remodel our guitars to put in new frets to play these freaking notes that don't exist in a Western scale. My one gripe that I would have with this album is that it does not overstay its welcome like Nemesius Pharma. Rather, it dips in certain sections. For some reason, about, I want to say, halfway through Sleep Drifter, my mind wandered, and it didn't come back until Billabong Valley, right when that piano or keys or guitar or trumpet, I don't know what is playing that melody line near the end, near the middle of Billabong Valley. And I don't know what instrument is doing that, but it caught my attention. I was like, okay, I'm back. It dipped out again in Doom City, but my attention was brought back with nuclear fusion. I'm very sad inside. But anyways, I also feel like at times the raw production, it can be great, but it can also be a little bit grating on the ears because of the microtonal tuning. It gets a little bit like, ears are bleeding, make it stop. It's still cool. Other than that, and other than I felt like the title closing track was a little anticlimactic, other than those things, this album jams. And my favorite tracks from Flying Microtonal Banana, Rattlesnake, Melting, Open Water, Billabong Valley, and Nuclear Fusion. At 7, we got Freedom is Free by Chicano Batman, a group that maybe some of you know about, maybe some of you don't know about, and if you don't know about them, and you're a big rock and roll fan, and you've been like, oh, rock and roll is dead, there's not cool rock and roll band. Freaking listen to me now. You need to listen to Chicano Batman. I mentioned this group in my South by Southwest video, but I don't believe I ever delved in depth with how I fell in love with this band. We were doing stage handling at the Blackheart Bar on Rainy Street in South by Southwest for the Cliff Bar Bash and Fry Clothing showcases that were happening at that bar. Temples played, freaking, not John Garro, God, what the hell's his name? John Solo? Ron Gallo, God bless, he played. Muddy Magnolias, they played. Rainbow Kitten Surprise, God, freaking modern music, weirdest names. You get people together and it's like, what are we going to call this? Rainbow Kitten Surprise? Alright, that sells, but hey, it works. And then Fridays, they had Chicano Batman. They closed out Fridays, and they could not have picked a better group to close this out. These guys come in, it's a van. You're in a band, you gotta get in the van. You're not gonna get the tour bus automatically, and if you're touring by Southwest, those streets are so narrow at points, it's like, getting a tour bus down that stuff is gonna be legitimately insane. Better to go with the van, and they were smart for doing that. And they hop out of this van, and they're in metal t-shirts, and they're just chill and relaxed, and it's these 4 Latino dudes, and you feel like almost that they're brothers. Really, they're just bandmates, but you get the sense that they have this strong kinship together. That was how I got introduced to these guys, was like that kind of scenario where I'm in the depth of it. I'm like, huh, this is Chicano Batman. Never heard of these guys before. They seem really chill, but at the same time, they're probably super busy. Well, I hope that doesn't affect their performance, because I really want to see what these guys do. A switch flipped. These guys go to get changed. They go from wearing these metal band t-shirts to being in these suave, I believe it was velvet, I don't know freaking fabric for shit, but it was just striped blue. It looked like something Ryan Gosling would wear at a freaking Oscars event, okay? And they just got these cool-ass suave suits on, and they get on stage, ladies and gentlemen, Chicano Batman, and they play this killer, retro, 70s rock, funk, and soul-inspired music. It blew my mind. They were the coolest thing that I saw, and I immediately went on Spotify, followed them, started streaming their albums. I bought this particular album because it was the album that came out that year, and I was like, okay, most of the tracks that I probably like are going to be on that album. Anyways, what do you need to know about Chicano Batman? Well, forming and releasing music sporadically since 2009, the group is the most suave thing to ever walk on this earth. Their music is the very definition of smooth coolness and soul. The band is composed of Bardo Martinez, lead vocals, keyboards, and guitar, Carlos Arevalo, guitar, Eduardo Arenas, bass, guitar, and vocals, and Gabriel Villa, drums. The group's sound draws from many different types of genres. It's a mix of, in my opinion, psychedelic soul, funk, indie, tropicalia, and rock. Best way to put it, when I listen to their music, I feel like I'm an undercover beat detective in New York circa late 1970s. Funky guitars and keys all the way, wah pedals, wow, 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 wow. I feel like I'm in Starsky and Hutch. I feel like I'm driving that cop car. I feel like I'm in the Beastie Boys Sabotage music video. Their music has that aesthetic, and it's so freaking pleasing because you don't get a lot of that in modern music. And here's a modern band that's just like, hey, you like that retro sound and feel, but you want it through modern production? Here you go. Thank you, Chicano Batman! This album, Freedom is Free, is the group's first major label release, and it is a doozy. My one gripe, other than a few preachy tracks here and there, is that I feel like the album is lacking a main narrative and thematic angle. Don't get me wrong, not every album has to be enjoyable, and even if an album does this, it doesn't have to tie each piece of the thematic and narrative elements into a neat, pretty little bow at the end for me to enjoy the album. But I will say, the more so that an album does this, the better I enjoy it. And if I am going to make the exception, the music has to be way more directed and focused and just a tinge more aggressive. other than Loose. And while I enjoy the Loose feeling is what draws me to Chicano's Batman's music. I didn't like how that looseness kind of went into how the album went into each track. I felt that I was kind of getting lost. I was like, there's a point here, but what is that point? I can't find that point. And when those preachy tracks do come up, what makes them so preachy is the fact that they're surrounded by other tracks in retrospect where you're like, how does that fit into that message? Perfect example, opening track, Pass You By. Beautiful message. You know, don't let life pass you by. You know, the short end of it, that's what that song's about. Go down a couple of tracks, you're an angel child. I'm a little confused. It sounds like you're trying to get with this girl, but is the girl like a metaphor on life? That was my only gripe with this album, and that's what ended up leading to those quote-unquote preachy tracks. But I will say this, overall, the music and the presentation and the performance by this group is so smooth and so cool. I have to put them on this list somewhere, and you need to listen to these guys. Please listen to this album, send them money, buy their merch. They're an up-and-coming band, and they need to take over the rock and roll world as we know it, because we need that coolness back in the presentation of rock music. And they do it authentically. There's no kind of like glitz and glamour and smoke. They're just like, hey, we're rock and rollers, but we also respect how suave the Rat Pack was. What if we combined the rock and roll, like, danger and the suaveness of the Rat Pack? Chicano Batman. At number 6, we got Is This the Life We Really Want by Roger Waters. Pink Floyd is my favorite group of all time, hands down, not just group, artist. So naturally, when any of the members have a solo release that comes out, I'm going to listen to it. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised by this recent Roger Waters solo album. For me, this is the most Pink Floydian thing to come out since The Wall. In fact, if you love Pink Floyd albums like The Wall and Animals, you're gonna love this album. Because this album is what happens when you take Pink Floyd's Final Cut, Pink Floyd's The Wall, Pink Floyd's Animals, and just a dash of the Roger Waters, like, oh, I am getting into the music of folk. Put that into a blender, and that is this album. I think the lyrics provided by Roger are some of the most biting and angry lyrics I've heard him pen in a long time. Case in point, Deja Vu. Deja Vu. I also love the back and forth between these very dreary English-style ballads with these sweeping orchestral scores behind them, and then these old-school 70s rock grooves, while simultaneously throughout the album, between the dreary ballads and the rocky, soulful grooves, you're sprinkling in some very experimental, eyebrow-popping electronica production. It is Pink Floyd, but for the modern age. For kids that probably aren't really into Pink Floyd and they want to get more into Pink Floyd, and they get through, you know, Animals, and they get through Wish You Were Here, Dark Side of the Moon, my favorite album of all time, Medell. Once a Pink Floyd, an emerging Pink Floyd head gets through all that discography and they're like, where do I go from here? I'd recommend this album. I think you're gonna dig this album quite a lot. My one gripe with it is with the mastering. Side note, I got an album coming out hopefully sometime this year. We're planning on this year. I don't know when. If I have to eventually release it for free on freaking Christmas, I will. I got my album mastered by this guy named Greg Ryerson. Greg Ryerson is a guy from Minneapolis. He has rare form mastering. He's worked with the likes of Dessa, Prince. He's from Minneapolis. Of course, everyone has a Prince story. The Cure, and I was just ecstatic because he was a teacher at my school that closed down. I met him through like some of my best friends who were students at the school. Long story short, we're mastering the album. He's talking about albums that have come out recently, and I'm talking about albums that come out recently, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm really digging that Roger Waters album. And he just stops at the board, turns, and he picks up the CD. He's like, this album? I'm like, yeah, the one with, like, you know, the Call of Duty Black Ops style cover with, like, the blacked out, you know, markings on the government documents. Yeah, that album. I freaking love it. And he's just like, I love the writing. This recording is bullshit. Like, he was so pissed And I discovered why when he played it for me in his studio with these really amazing monitors, top of the line, best material in there. Even though these are old speakers, these are killer speakers. And for mastering, the idea is that you're hearing the audio in its truest, rawest form. You're not getting the glitz and glamour and the EQ and the saturation and the natural compression that happens with like your car stereo or your laptop or what have you. It's the rawest form of the audio from the microphones. He played it for me there. That album sounded like garbage. It made me kind of lose my respect for this album and kind of drop it down a bit. I was like, oh man, Rogers, you got the money to master this shit so well. It is barely noticeable. I will say this, it's barely noticeable. Unless you're like a huge music geek like I am, you're not gonna hear that. You can put it on your car stereo, it's gonna sound great. You're gonna put it on your laptop, whatever, it's fine. I don't recommend the laptop speaker listening experience, but hey, you gotta get your music somehow. That's the way you gotta do it, that's the way you gotta do it. But I will say, for the true audiophiles out there, listen to this album on speakers made after a certain point in the late aughts. I want to say 2008 or so is a safe year, because anything before that, the mixing is gonna be so weird. You're gonna wonder half the time if the unintelligible background instrumentation is intentionally mixed way down or is mistakenly lost and muddied in the mix. I'm not sure. Not to mention the acoustic guitars on certain songs lack a fullness and tone. It's like high frequency range guitars. It's choppy and I'm like, I don't dig this. But that's entirely subjective. That's not objective. Objectively, I think the writing on this album is fantastic. And if you're a huge Pink Floyd fan, you gotta give this album a spin. And out of all the albums of 2017, it lands at number 6 in my top 10. Favorite tracks. Is This the Life We Really Want? Bird in a Gale, that experimental electronica production going from Is This the Life We Really Want to Bird in a Gale. Phenomenal. Smell the Roses, The Last Refugee, and Picture That.